Hello and welcome everyone to today's WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar, Psychosocial Hazards and Mental Health in the Construction Industry. I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania. WorkSafe Tasmania Month is a long-running initiative funded by the WorkCover Tasmania Board, delivered by WorkSafe Tasmania. Please now take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. Please type and submit any questions that you have for today's presenter into the questions window on your control panel. Questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. Today's presentation is also being recorded. Recorded webinars will be made available at the end of WorkSafe Tasmania Month on WorkSafe Tasmania's YouTube page. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Carol Hon from Queensland University of Technology. Carol is a senior lecturer at the School of Architecture and Built Environment at Queensland University of Technology. Carol holds a Doctor of Philosophy from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University and is an expert in construction management, specialising in health and safety. Carol's passion lies in reducing incidents and improving safety, health and wellbeing. Carol currently serves as the Construction Safety Theme Coordinator of the Building 4.0 Cooperative Research Centre. Carol was awarded a prestigious Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Research Award for her project Improving Mental Health and Safety in the Construction Industry. Before moving to academia, Carol worked in the industry as the quantity surveyor, gaining invaluable industry experience, and we welcome Carol.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for the introduction. To kick off the presentation today, I would like to introduce my research team. Other than myself and my former PhD student, Chen Junyan Sun, I've got my colleague, Associate Professor Bo Shah from the same School of Architecture and Built Environment. And in my team, I've got two organizational psychologists, Dr. Kirsten Wei from the University of Queensland and Professor Lavina Jamison from the School of Management at QUT. The presentation today is based on my research funded by the Australian Research Council for the project Improving Mental Health and Safety in the Construction Industry. Okay. Let's move on to the introduction, and this is the outline of the presentation today. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the project background, what motivates me to conduct this research, and to share with you the research framework in this project, and I'll highlight some key findings and finally provide a conclusion. Let's move on to the introduction. So how serious is mental health issue in construction industry? Here are some statistics. In Australia, the suicide rate of male construction workers is 97% higher than that of non-construction male workers. And construction workers are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than from safety accidents on site. Suicide rate of male construction workers was 26.6 per 100,000 persons, as compared with, in general, male workers was only 13.2 per 100,000 persons, so it's more than doubled. And this is not just the situation in Australia, it is actually a global issue. Here are some statistics in the UK. There were 507 number of suicides in the construction sector in 2021, and the suicide rate of the construction industry is 4 times higher than the other sectors. There were 34 suicides per 100,000 workers in the construction sector in 2021. And similar situation happened in the America. Here we also got some statistics to support this. The construction industry in the America was one of the highest suicide rates as compared to the other industries. And the suicide rate of male construction workers was about 50 per 100,000 in 2016, and is almost twice the total suicide rate for all the working men in 32 states in America, and is 5 times greater than the rate for all fatal work-related injuries in the construction industry in 2018. So why construction industry has such a serious issue in mental health. Research shows that the work environment of the construction industry normally cultivates a high level of psychosocial hazards that would affect mental health of the workforce. The construction industry is well known to be labor intensive, is very physically demanding, and is male dominated. The workforce has a macho culture. You don't want to be seen to be soft, and it's hard for our construction workforce to reach out for help. And it's project based. When one project finishes, you never know whether there will be another project lined up, and it's high risk physically, and you have to deal with multiple stakeholders, etc. In this research, I'm particularly interested to look at psychosocial hazards in the construction industry at site level, and how these psychosocial hazards will affect mental health of our construction workforce in the construction site. That's my passion as a construction management researcher specializing in health and safety. So why should construction companies care about mental health of their employees? Well, it is a workplace health and safety issue. Starting in 2021, ISO 45003 provides a guideline for how to manage psychosocial hazards. So it's part of the component of occupational health and safety management, and companies are legally required to provide physically and psychologically healthy and safer environment for the employees. In Australia, in 2022, the Model Work Health and Safety Regulation was amended to incorporate psychosocial risk management requirements, and New South Wales was the first state to adopt this. And in Queensland, where I'm from, it started in April this year. Statistics shows that the suicide and related behavior in Australian construction industry estimated to cost 1.5 billion Australian dollars each year. So that is really a business case for companies to really care about mental health of their employees. And there also is implication for physical health and safety of the employee as well. So employees with poor mental health tend to have more workplace accidents, and there's also implication for the performance and productivity of the workforce. Over 600 million was lost in Australian construction industry in 2018 because of presenteeism. So presenteeism is a common thing when employees' mental health is not good. So there's really a genuine need to care about the workforce mental health by construction companies or any companies. When we start the project, we look at the literature, and we identified a few gaps and issues that we think we can potentially address and improve. When we look at the literature, we find that while there are some studies looking at psychosocial hazards and mental health in the construction industry, but we don't have a holistic understanding or how big is the effect of these psychosocial hazards on mental health. So we decided to conduct a meta-analysis to quantitatively look at the strength and of the associations between psychosocial hazards and mental health in the construction industry based on the published studies. And when we look at the literature, we also identified that while there were some studies looking at mental health and psychosocial hazards in Australia, but probably not on site-based level. And existing studies normally would not refer it back to any theoretical model. So we think it would be good to actually have a better understanding to see how these psychosocial hazards actually make sense to our construction workforce in Australia, and map it again as established theoretical model so that it's easier to compare with different industries. So that's our second objective, to identify psychosocial hazards and potential interrelationships by looking at how site-based construction practitioners make sense of psychosocial hazards and mental health. And we also identify that there is missing knowledge of how these psychosocial hazards interconnect with each other and how they interplay to predict mental health issues, mental health of the construction workers. So we decide to develop a mathematical model. We finally choose a Bayesian network analysis to manage psychosocial hazards and quantitatively evaluate their influence on mental health. And finally, we would like to give recommendations to how to manage psychosocial hazards for better mental health in the Australian construction industry. So that's our research questions and objectives. Here comes the research framework. This is pictorial representation of what I've done in the research. For achieving the first objective, we conduct a meta-analysis quantifying the effect size of the impact of psychosocial hazards on mental health in the construction industry. And then we conduct semi-structured interviews to look at how do our construction workforce make sense of psychosocial hazards and how they feel about their mental health. And then for objectives 3 and 4, we conduct a questionnaire survey to collect data to build up our Bayesian network model. And this study is theoretically based on job demands and resources model. We think that this model will help us to enable cross-industry comparison for our findings. Now let's move on to the key findings. That's the exciting part. For the first objective, as I mentioned, we conduct a systematic literature review, and in particular, we conduct a meta-analysis. So we reviewed 48 studies. These 48 studies look at psychosocial hazards and mental health in the construction industry. They were from Asia, North America, Africa, Europe, and Oceania, so a good spectrum of studies all over the world. And out of 48 studies, 36 were published after 2010. So it shows the increasing importance of this topic in the past decade. And the sample size for these 48 studies were more than 13,000. And most of these participants were male construction workers. 13 studies focused on construction trade workers, and another 19 focused on construction professionals. In the meta-analysis, we included 14 typical psychosocial hazards, and for the mental health outcomes, we include both context-free psychological strain, for example, anxiety, depression, and we also included job-related psychological strain, for example, job burnout, and any measurement of mental health, including job-related, into the measurement. So we also included GHQ and K10 and DAS. So this is the summary of our meta-analysis. For the pooled overall correlation coefficient between psychosocial hazards and mental health is a moderately positive relationship, 0.28. But when we look at the individual psychosocial hazards, the pool effect size is bigger. The top one being role conflict, and followed by role ambiguity, job insecurity, and interpersonal conflict. So this, we find this interesting because while we often think about role overload would be a very important psychosocial hazards affecting mental health in construction industry, the meta-analysis actually show us something a little bit different. is the role conflict that matters most. So we kind of interpret that because role overload is so common in construction industry, if kind of people might have already accepted that that's part of their job. And when it comes down to the negative impact in a quantitative manner, how negative it affects the mental health of our construction workforce, it turns out to be not the strongest. It's still quite strong, but not just not the strongest. But role conflict stood out. Our meta-analysis show a quite high level of heterogeneity. It's quite common, but we took extra step to look at why is the case. And we look at the year publication, we conduct subgroup analysis to see what's the differences if these studies were conducted in different location, different occupation. So in general, we find that construction employees in Asia were more influenced by psychosocial hazards as compared to those in other 4 continents. And we also identify that construction professionals and construction trade workers, they will experience similar adverse effects caused by psychosocial hazards on mental health, but high job demands would generally affect the mental health of construction trade workers more strongly than that of construction professionals. We think that's quite reasonable because construction trade workers, they had different job demands from professionals, and their job demands would likely be more physically demanding. And we also look at the mental health outcome. How do we measure mental health outcome, whether it matters, whether it affects the relationship? And in general, job-related psychological strain, for example, job burnout, would have stronger effect size with psychosocial hazards rather than context-free psychological strain. And the time frame, how we measure the mental health outcome and psychosocial hazards also matters. In general, the relationship between psychosocial hazards and mental health outcomes measured in a short period of time, for example, less than 3 months, would be stronger than if we say the period of time is longer than 3 months. Okay, so this is the summary of our objective 1. And in general, we find out the correlation between psychosocial hazards and mental ill health was moderately positive at a level of 0.28. And role conflict had the strongest significant correlation with mental health, and followed by role ambiguity, job insecurity, and interpersonal conflict. And we also identified that the year of publication and the subgroup analysis reviewed that the between study variance, the heterogeneity would be potentially explained by location, occupation, outcome, and time frame. For further information about this finding, you can refer to our publication in Safety Science. Let's move on to what we find out from our interviews for our objective 2 to look at how do our construction workforce make sense of psychosocial hazards and mental health. We conduct 33 interviews. They are all construction practitioners in Australia in different states, and 31 of them were male, only 2 female, and their work experience ranged from less than 5 years to more than 20 years. They were they working as a site management, tradesperson, and apprentice. They work from first tier 1 contractor down to self-employed builder and trade specific contractor. So quite a wide spectrum of background of our interviewees. We asked them a few interview questions, and I just summarize and highlight a few that I find interesting. we asked them what does mental health mean for our site-based construction practitioners, and the data shows that there were four key themes. Some describe their mental health as comfortable, as safe, so quite random, and some describe as people's mind and way of thinking, which is quite stable and you build up over time based on your lifelong education or your experience. And some describe mental health as positive moods, attitudes, or emotions, which is something that you can quickly change. Today would be different from yesterday. And some describe mental health as stress, frustrated, anxiety, upset, low mood, mentally drained, depressed. So these are mental health outcomes, negative mental health outcomes. So we realized that for our interviewees, if they had prior knowledge in mental health or they're more exposed to mental health trainings, then they find we find them easier to articulate what do they mean mental health. But otherwise, they really struggle to sensibly talk about what mental health meant to them. So that also highlights the importance of mental health literacy, raise the awareness so that they can understand better and talk about it and articulate what they feel. So the key question we ask is, do they experience any psychosocial hazards in their workplace? And ask them to give example. So we identified a total of 18 psychosocial hazards, and we try to map against the established psychosocial hazards from the previous literature in Jamison et al. 2016 to see how our construction industry share similar common psychosocial hazards with the other industries. Out of the 18 we identified, the 12 of them we can categorize according to the existing literature, and then we identified 6 emerged psychosocial hazards that's salient to our construction industry, including safety concerns. So the job they're performing is actually physically high risk. So they also worry about their having accident on site that give them a mental toll. And they're working in the harsh environment. They care about their safety and exposure to traumatic events they themselves or they may have witnessed someone in their workplace a traumatic accident that also affect their mental health. Job insecurity, which is quite common to different industries, but because construction industry is particularly project-based, so that might intensify the effect of this job insecurity to the mental health of the workforce. And task interdependency is trade-based. When one trade cannot finish the job, the other trade cannot come in. So that would also affect how effectively they can perform their work, and that might potentially affect their mental health, different client demand and contract pressure as well. So not surprised, work overload became one of the most frequently mentioned psychosocial hazards in the interviews. And we find that when they talk about role overload, they mentioned hours, day, long time, deadlines, overload, workloads. These are the dominant works relating to role overload. And we categorize their opinions into 2 different themes, time pressure and excessive workload. And for time pressure is can be from long work hours and tight deadline or schedules. And for deadline or schedule, they mention it's competing, it's extreme, it's ambitious, unrealistic, unachievable, never long enough, poor and tight. And for excessive workload, they mentioned there's a lot of physical work and getting pushed to get the job done, too many responsibilities to handle by oneself, etc. So that also echoes what we find from our meta-analysis. Well, overall, being most frequently mentioned psychosocial hazard in the interview, but kind of is more or less being accepted as part of the job, is the norm in the industry. So that make us feel confident that the meta-analysis we find role overload not being the strongest, but role conflict being the strongest. So in the interview, we also identify that psychosocial hazards are connected to people's mental health, and they describe some of the categories here. Role overload would give them the feeling of depression, and role overload cause them to be stressful. Interpersonal conflict make them upset. Role conflict make them feel frustrated, and the safety concerns of accidents would make them feel stressful as well. And the client demand make them feel annoyed or stressed, and damper on mood. Contract pressure make them feel frustrated. Lack of supervisor support make them feel angry and frustrated. Low job control also make them feel frustrated. So some of these are quite the outcome, mental health outcomes are quite negative and can't be ignored. And in general, we also see that psychosocial hazards that's belonging to the categories of job demands, they have a more prevalent or prevalent effects on negative mental health outcomes than those related to job resources. So kind of it implies that we cannot improve mental health by just giving more resources, but ignoring the job demand. It's actually job demands that have a stronger impact on people's mental health rather than job resources. And something we also find very interesting throughout the interviews, the interrelationships among psychosocial hazards emerged. We didn't purposely ask this in the interview, but the data just emerged. So we find it particularly interesting. For example, lack of supervisor support and role overload and interpersonal conflict. So these are psychosocial hazards that are heavily connected with the other psychosocial hazards. That means if we can potentially do something to improve interpersonal conflict, reduce role overload, and reduce the lack of supervisor support, provide more support, then there can be cascading effect to improve the other psychosocial hazards. So here we have an example for role overload. The interviewee described that it is related to mental interpersonal conflict. If I've got too much on my plate, then would make me easily have conflict with other people because I'm agitated. And so role overload will also affect the cognitive demand. So you've got too many things to do and everything require your 100% attention, then you are cognitively overload. And role overload may also lead to lack of co-worker support. So if you are doing too many things and you just don't have the spare capacity, the time to look after others and provide support to the others, you can't even manage your own work. Yeah, so it's just what I say. Role overload, lack of supervisor support, interpersonal conflict, highly connected to other psychosocial hazards. So if we can do something about it, we can improve other psychosocial hazards as well. So here's a summary for what I want to achieve in Objective 2. We identified 18 psychosocial hazards according to the job demand and resources model, so that finding can enable us to do cross-industry comparisons, see how we are different, and we share common psychosocial hazards with other industries such as manufacturing and mining. And we particularly identify 6 new new psychosocial hazards that shows salient characteristics specific to the construction industry. And we find it particularly interesting to see the interrelationship among these psychosocial hazards emerged from our interview findings. And for details of these findings, please feel free to refer to our publication in this journal article. Well, for our objective 3 and 4, we conduct a questionnaire survey, which enable us to build up a Bayesian network model. Based on our interview findings, because we identified interrelationships among psychosocial hazards, because these psychosocial hazards are interrelated, they're interdependent. That means traditional classical statistical modeling might not be the best option to move forward. So we consider different options, and finally we pick up the Bayesian network analysis, which can take into consideration of interdependencies of psychosocial hazards and missing value, and the sample size would not be a problem. So that's why we pick up Bayesian network analysis, because of its ability to look into the interdependencies of psychosocial hazards. So here is the profile of the survey respondents. 55% male and then the rest female, and these are their profiles. And some of them are tradespeople, some of them are site project manager, supervisors, site engineers, contract administrators, health and safety professionals on site, and site-based estimator, etc. And the sample are from different states, not just from Queensland. Even Queensland got the highest response rate. So here is the steps how I developed the Bayesian network model. We identify the psychosocial hazards through the literature, through the meta-analysis, interviews, and we decided to include 11 psychosocial hazards in the Bayesian network model. And through the questionnaire survey, we collect the data we need, and we do a bit of data processing and cleaning before we build the network. And we use the PC algorithm in the software package of Genie to generate the analysis. And we also conduct in between, we also conduct an industry focus group to check the preliminary Bayesian network structure to make sure that it makes sense, and if there's any true direction connection, we've got to make a call which direction we think is more appropriate in the construction industry. We draw on the expertise of our industry advisory group to provide us the information. And then we developed the conditional probability table using expectation maximization algorithm. And we also validate our model. We did sensitivity analysis, and then we also identify different scenarios that we can manipulate to improve mental health. So that's the process of how we develop the Bayesian network model. Here is how it looks like. This is our baseline Bayesian network model. So the model has a quite good prediction power. The overall prediction accuracy was 88.27%, which is quite good. And based on the prediction, 66% of the site-based construction practitioners, they suffered from poor mental health. Here, poor mental health, we refer to the mild, moderate, and severe states of K10. So the mental health was being measured by K10, and we predict the data shows us that 66% of them were in the poor mental health categories. And we also identified poor physical environment, contract pressure, and lack of co-worker support. These are the root knocks in the model. They're at the top, which means that they played an important role in determining the probability of other psychosocial hazards. They can influence other psychosocial hazards. There's cascading effect falling down from them. That means if we can improve these knocks, then we can potentially influence the other psychosocial hazards and improve mental health. And we also did some sensitivity analysis. We tracked the sensitivity to findings by looking at the mutual information table. And we also did the sensitivity to parameters by looking at the tornado diagram. So in summary, yeah, these are hard to see. We find that lack of job control, lack of co-worker support, role ambiguity, role conflict, and lack of supervisor support, they were the most influential hazards to mental health. So basically, the darker red color means they are more influential to mental health. So after generating the Bayesian network model, what's the beauty of having Bayesian network analysis is we can see what if happens. So we did some scenario analysis to see what if we change the psychosocial hazards. We can remove it. We can set it to 100% low level. That means barely any psychosocial hazards. Then what would be the improvement to mental health? So here we have, so we look at mental health, which will be good, or mental health, which will be severe. So if we set low job control to 100% low level, means we have perfect job control. So in the scenario of perfect job control, the mental health of construction workers would change from 33% to 41%. So that is a positive improvement of 8%. And under perfect job control, those construction practitioners originally in severe mental health, it would be under the probability of 21%, but it will be reduced to 18%. So it's good. Similarly, when we have 100% low level of role conflict, so we barely have any role conflict, then there would be an improvement of good mental health of 7%. And there will be a reduction of severe mental health by 1% probability. So we're all talking about probability. But overall, we can see that just controlling one single psychosocial hazard on the probability distribution of good and severe mental health, kind of not that significant. So we tried another strategy to look at what if we can control a portfolio of psychosocial hazards under the joint scenarios, how much can we improve mental health? So we find that if we can jointly control multiple psychosocial hazards, we can have a stronger impact. We can better increase the probability of good mental health than controlling one individual hazard. Yeah, that makes sense. And we try different combination, and finally we find that by managing a combination of lack of job control, lack of co-worker support, role conflict, and job insecurity, we can achieve the highest probability of 77% of good mental health if we have a full hazard scenario. But if we add additional one, poor physical environment, so we control 5 psychosocial hazard, we can achieve the highest probability, 83%, of having good mental health. So we find that is very significant and worth further investigating. So to summarize for the Bayesian network analysis we did, we identified that the most influential psychosocial hazards which are interconnected with one another that we should control should be low job control, lack of co-worker support, work ambiguity, work conflict, and lack of supervisor support. And this Bayesian network model can have a practical impact to the industry to provide a solid recommendation what can be done on site by changing a set of psychosocial hazards. And we published these findings in 2 journal articles, and feel free to have a look for further details. Here comes the conclusion. Based on what we find from this research, we find better understanding of psychosocial hazards in the Australian context in construction industry, and we contextualized the elements of job demand and job resources model in the context of construction industry in Australia. And we developed a predictive model to quantify the relationships of psychosocial hazards and show how they interplay with one another to affect mental health. And these findings would be useful to practitioners and other researchers to identify ways to better manage psychosocial hazards and how to improve mental health. Yeah, we've got some recommendation for further research. When we did the meta-analysis, we really find it difficult to identify comparable scales, how to measure psychosocial hazards and mental health. We will hope to see in the future there can be a standardized measurement of psychosocial hazards and mental health that can be applied. And psychosocial hazards, they're interrelated with one another, but at the same time, they are connected with factors other than mental health, like some life-related factors and need for recovery. So we also conduct another analysis looking at how these psychosocial hazards would have effect on people's need for recovery. And these psychosocial hazards, they're being identified, and definitely we need to come up with some strategies to improve them. And we see that it would be great to have longitudinal design in the future to test out the effectiveness of these strategies and the actual improvement of people's mental health after they're being implemented. And we can also do a bit of simulation using agent-based modeling to see what if these strategies are applied on site, what would be the potential outcome. The Bayesian network model we developed can be a useful tool to understand psychosocial hazards and how to control them. And at the moment, we are working on the agent-based modeling and analysis to test out what if we provide mental health training and how frequent we should provide mental health training, how to optimize it, and what if we provide more co-worker support in the job environment by allowing them to share workload, and what if we give more frequent paid breaks during the work time. How would these strategies have an impact on the work team's mental health? So we are working on it at the moment, and I would love to share the findings with you when it is ready. Thank you. That's all for me. Welcome any question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carol Hunn from Queensland University of Technology for your presentation, Psychosocial Hazards and Mental Health in the Construction Industry. As Carol said, look, she's happy to take any questions from people in the audience, so please type your questions into the questions window on your control panel for Dr. Carol Hunn. And Dr. Carol's presentation has been run as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month, and so please do head to worksafe.tas.gov.au for any other webinars and in-person events that we are running down here in Tasmania statewide. Carol, can I ask, is your presentation, it has been recorded, but can attendees receive a copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, no problem.
All right, good. There's a lot of information, a lot of statistics that I'm sure people would value being able to share. You talked, Carol, about I guess having an understanding of what mental health is. How important are, I guess, organisations such as Mates in Construction in that space?
Yeah, at the moment I'm working with the WOW Center in Griffith University um, to look at um, the amazing construction because they also conduct the POCON survey, which is people at work, but in construction industry. So they are doing similar research, looking at how these psychosocial hazards would influence mental health and suicide ideation. Um, so we are looking forward to share those findings when the team thinks it's ready. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Just a few comments that come through. So thank you again for your presentation, and some very valuable and important stats have come from that presentation. Carol, with respect, I guess, to the lack of co-worker support, are you able to expand on this element of your findings?
Mm. Um, we think it's common in the construction industry. If you are electrician, for a small job, you might be just on your own, and there's no one to provide you with support other than yourself. And some trades, you might be working in a small gang, and there's not much so co-worker support you can anticipate. And we find that the co-worker support is also related to the supervisor support. And sometimes it's hard to say because your co-worker might also be your supervisor. That that person may be a leading hand. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish in a small gang in some trades. So I guess yeah, the lack of supervisor support and co-worker support, they kind of related, and it depends on what scenario you are talking about. And at the moment, we are doing the agent-based modeling to simulate what if there can be more co-worker support. Then we think of allowing the work team to share workload and see how it will go. Yeah. Well, it's still very initial analysis, so we hope to see some good findings.
So in respect to that, Carol, is it more around working alone rather than conflict?
I think they both could exist. So if work alone in some particular trade, then it can be lack of co-worker support. But then role conflict usually is you face different demands from your work, but they are conflicting with each other. You cannot perform all of them at the same time, or you perform one of them and you are actually in contradictory with the others. So yeah, that surprises. It comes up to be the strongest psychosocial hazards quantitatively influencing mental health. But in the interview, one good example of role conflict being um, the supervisor left the job and a junior staff had to step up to do his or her own job, and then as well as the supervisor who left the job. So obviously, the job description of both roles conflict with each other, and that person really struggled. Not just about role conflict, it's a complication of learning curve, step up yourself to another role that's when you're not that experienced. Yeah, so from the interview, we find that these psychosocial hazards, they're really interrelated and hard to just isolate them, look at them individually.
Thank you, Carol. Psychosocial hazards and psychosocial risks, is there a difference between the two?
Yes, so you can have psychosocial hazards before you come up with a risk. So they exist, they're kind of neutral, and then if you don't manage them well, it becomes a risk.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Do you have an approximate cost for implementing changes within the workplace within the construction industry, and what would it involve in terms of significant cost to the business and implementation?
I don't have any research finding on how much it would cost to improve these psychosocial hazards. But what I'm doing in the agent-based modeling is I try to optimize. For example, giving a break, there would be productivity loss. It would cost money, and how frequent we should give the break, or how frequent we should uh, give mental health training. So I'm kind of doing this kind of simulation, hoping to compare the productivity loss or as uh, with the improvement in mental health. But I don't have solid research finding on how much does it cost.
All right, thanks, Carol. Are you able to explain why you used the Bayesian model instead of the structural equation modelling, and what would be the effect on psychosocial hazards on employee performance?
Yeah, so the reason why we choose the Bayesian network analysis instead of structural equation modeling, mainly because these psychosocial hazards as independent variable, they are interrelated. They are interdependent. That means traditional classical statistical model, including regression and structural equation modeling, they are not the best option. Because these assume independent variables, they are independent. They are not interrelated. So that's the main reason why. And also, Bayesian network analysis allows the expert input, expert elicitation, which we think it is a strength. And the sample size can be relatively smaller, depending on the quality of the data, but in general, it doesn't matter too much as compared to structural equation modeling. You would need a relatively bigger data set and kind of normal distribution, but Bayesian network analysis does not require normal distribution. So that suits our needs and suits our uh, conceptual background because we identify these psychosocial are interrelated and we don't have a big data set. So Bayesian network seems to better suit our needs. But being said that, structural
Thank you,
equation
Carol.
modeling is also a good method of analysis if you have a big data set which kind of normally distributed.
Thank you, Carol. Are you able to provide any insights on the social research in developing countries, and possibly how what the situation is of construction professionals in those areas?
Um, I mainly focus in Australia, but I think my colleagues in the UNSW, they are doing very good study looking at the mental health of construction industry in developing countries, in Ghana, in Nigeria. So yeah, there are studies out there, but I'm just not the best person to answer this.
Thank you, Carol. So a comment has come through. Much of the data is based on male workers, as you commented. Is there a significant difference or comparison in suicide rates and poor mental health for female and non-binary workers in the construction industry?
For my sample, I didn't have non-binary, so it's either female or male, and I didn't ask them the suicide ideation. I only used K10, which measure distress as the mental health outcome variable. So I don't know whether their poor mental health would really affect their thinking of suicide. Hope that
Okay,
answered the
thanks.
question.
Thank you. There's still time to ask Dr. Carol Hon from Queensland University of Technology any questions in regards to her presentation today, Psychosocial Hazards and Mental Health in the Construction Industry. And Dr. Carol Hon is presenting as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month, which runs throughout the month of October. We have webinars running again for the next 2 weeks. Please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to see what other presentations we do have running. As well, if you are located down here in Tasmania, we are running statewide events from the 16th of October. So please, again, head to the WorkSafe Tasmania website, have a look at the WorkSafe Month program and see what locations events will be in your area.
Yeah, I'll add on to my previous answer for developing countries. So my colleagues in the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, they also conduct study looking into mental health of the Nigerian construction industry. Yeah, feel free to search for more information through Google Scholar. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carol. And with no further questions coming through, we'll begin to wrap up. So again, we do thank today's presenter, Dr. Carol Hon from Queensland University of Technology, for her webinar, Psychosocial Hazards and Mental Health in the Construction Industry. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available after WorkSafe Tasmania Month on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube page. And as we also mentioned, those who attended today's presentation will also receive a copy of Dr. Carol Hon's PowerPoint presentation. Please do head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to see what other activities we have running throughout October for WorkSafe Tasmania Month. Thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to our presenter, Dr. Carol Hon.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.